We had left off talking about the Qumran scrolls. We're in the area of textual criticism. We're on pages 26 and 27 of the syllabus. If you're trying to figure out where we are, we're on additional materials. Most of it is photographic and visual, so we end up seeing it on the screen here in PowerPoint rather than having it in the syllabus itself. And yet I bring up a number of points that I will expect you to remember for future reference, for quizzes, and for final exam, and I usually try to emphasize that and bring it out for you. The manuscript that you're looking at right now, up here on the screen, is the Qumran scroll of a Habakkuk commentary. And we look at it, it is given the title 1QPHAB, or just HB. The 1 stands for the cave number, it's cave number 1. The Q stands for the location, Qumran. The P, the lowercase p, is for the Hebrew word pesher, which means commentary. And HAB is the abbreviation of the biblical book Habakkuk. So it is the commentary of Habakkuk found in Cave 1 at Qumran, is the way we would interpret that symbolism that's used there, the abbreviations used for the titles and identification of these manuscripts. As you look at this commentary, it is a verse-by-verse commentary. It gives the text itself, and then it gives the interpretation. It covers all of chapters 1 and 2. Within that box is the text itself, and then right after that is the word pesher in the blue circle that indicates that that's the beginning of the commentary, and that's the way it's treated all the way through. It's very consistent. The producer of this manuscript was very careful to give us the text and then identify what was commentary by beginning it with pesher. Now, there's something interesting about this, and that is, number one, we do have a text. And we can check that text against what we now have and call the Masoretic text to see if there's any variation in that text. In this particular manuscript, there are a few variations, very minor, but still there. And then in the interpretation, in the pesher itself, we find a number of things that show up, and we find out that the interpretive philosophy is very similar to that of the Aramaic targums. It's expansionistic. It expands on the text. It often interprets the text figuratively or allegorically. For example, on this particular text, it says the interpretation of the passage is that God will not destroy his people by the hand of the nations, but into the hand of his chosen ones, God will give the judgment of all the nations. And that's pretty straightforward, and yet it goes a little bit beyond the text and adds to it slightly. But that is characteristic of commentary, whether you're doing a modern commentary or whether you're looking at an ancient commentary. They're very instructive, help us to understand how they interpreted the text, what kind of hermeneutics they applied, as well as to look what text they had to see what has been preserved. When we look at the textual status of the 200 plus biblical texts from Qumran, we find that 20% of them are written in Qumran practice. By Qumran practice, we mean they're sort of free in their rendering. Not exactly literal copies of the text in many cases. They tend to reflect the same basic text as the Masoretic text, but sometimes add targumic additions and sometimes give evidence that perhaps it is an updated translation rather than a copy of the text. One of the Isaiah scrolls we mentioned, Rosenblum talked about it being a translation in updated Hebrew. We're not talking about an updating of the text. We're talking about a translation of the text into more current Hebrew. And it's clearly a translation because of some of the additions and expansions in it. That's 20%. Also, that takes into account some of the excessive differences in spellings of a single word throughout the entire body of one manuscript. And the very interesting thing here has been pointed out that even though these are not identical to the Masoretic text, they may have used a proto-masoretic text because it is very close to it at times. And some of the expansions are explainable on the basis of having the proto-masoretic text rather than, say, having a text that may have underlaid the Septuagint or the Samaritan Pentateuch. Then we have 35% of those 200 plus manuscripts are definitely identified with proto-masoretic texts. That is a decrease from 60%, which Emmanuel Tove had originally given as a figure for these texts. In his first edition of his book on the textual criticism of the Old Testament, he said 60% of the 200 plus biblical manuscripts were definitely proto-masoretic. Why did he change? Well, we'll take a look at some of the changes and see them here. He dropped it to 35%, but that does not mean that then that's limited to only 35%. We've already seen that some of the 20% in Qumran practice could be included among the proto-masoretic texts. The pre-Samaritan texts he gave as 5%. In other words, these are Hebrew texts that could have been the Vorlage. Vorlage from the German to lie before, to be beneath, to be the foundation of. All of these translations, old translations, had to have a Hebrew base to translate from. And so some have hypothesized that there was a different Hebrew base for the Septuagint than was used for the Proto-Masoretic, than was used for the Samaritan Pentateuch, for example. And so in this, he's saying that this group of 5% of the 200 plus biblical texts could very well be those that may have been used as the original Hebrew from which the Samaritan Pentateuch might have been translated into Samaritan Hebrew. Or they are modern Hebrew, modern in that day, updated Hebrew, current Hebrew translations of the Samaritan Pentateuch placed into the Jewish script rather than using the Samaritan script. And 5% show Septuagintal affinity. Now, in his prior edition, he had said 5% for both of these, 5% for both together. Now he is saying 5% for each. So that's part of the reason for the switch on the Proto-Masoretic text figures. The non-aligned texts he gives now as 35%, where he had previously given those as 15%. So you can see the 20% increase there, and the 5% increase in the previous two accounts for then the 25% difference in the second category. So what he's done is take 25% of the text and reclassify them so that 5% landed in the pre-Samaritan and Septuagintal affinity, distributed across those two categories, and the remaining 20% were assigned to the non-aligned text. What does he mean by non-aligned? Non-aligned means that the texts are either too brief or too fragmentary to be able to identify whether they really support a Septuagint text or the Masoretic text. But as he points out, his conviction is that a large number of these show significant agreement with the Masoretic text, and he believes that if we had more of those texts, that type of agreement would continue, and then he would reclassify them. But in order to be objective, in order to have some sort of standard and limitations, he has reclassified these 20% of the text into the non-aligned texts instead. Now, if you take a look at all of this and try to figure out what's involved, if you were to put this in a bar graph with special colors and everything, it would still show the dominance of the texts at Qumran and from the other Dead Sea Scrolls at Wadi Murba'at, at Nachal Hever, and other places, demonstrate that the Proto-Masoretic text is the dominant text form. Only 5% of these texts support the Septuagint, directly and without question. That there's readings in the Septuagint which are very close to these, and then you have to deal with what are these texts. Are they Hebrew back translations of the Greek Septuagint copies to try to instruct others in what the differences are in the translations, or is it actually a copy of the Hebrew that was used by the Septuagint translators? Obviously, they're not the same exact manuscripts used by the Septuagint translators. Otherwise, they wouldn't be here at Qumran. They'd more likely be in Alexandria and in the ancient library at Alexandria, which was destroyed. So we don't have those manuscripts that they utilized for the Septuagint. And today there's a great deal of debate. Were the differences between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text due to the translation techniques of the Septuagint translators? or was it due to having a different Hebrew text? If they had a different Hebrew text, how did that different Hebrew text come about? And one of the answers to that is the different Hebrew text at Alexandria, Egypt was actually a combination of targumic interpretations with the Hebrew text that were then transmitted into the Greek. For example, in the Greek Septuagint, there is one characteristic that occurs repeatedly, and that's what is called double translation, where you have a single word. For example, in Genesis chapter 1, verses 10 through 12, you have that those plants reproduced after their kind. Now that after their kind has normally been translated in the Septuagint with the Greek word genos, where we get our word genre from, where we get the word generation, where we get a lot of terms. And yet, in at least two places, it is expanded to use two different words. It's genos kai hamoioteta, which means according to kind and likeness. A double translation of the one term, leminehu, in the Hebrew. Min means likeness, the lamed is according to, and its kind is the hu suffix, its. So when you look at that, there are two Greek words, a Greek phrase. Genos kai hamoioteta is used to translate the one Hebrew word. Double translation. The same type of double translation is characteristic of the Aramaic targums. You go through the Aramaic targums and you find constantly you have this type of phenomenon occurring, of double translation, sometimes doubling a word, sometimes doubling a phrase, in order to expand it, in order to give explanation, in order to make certain people understand. So it could very well be that the Jews at Alexandria, Egypt, in translating the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek, thought that perhaps the Greek, being a foreign and Gentile language, then as a translation did not have to keep to the exact form of the Hebrew. And so they felt free then to supply interpretive comments that were already current in the Targumic tradition. The Targumic tradition begins in the time of Ezra and is a translation of the Hebrew into Aramaic with explanation and is expanded. The Targums are known for being expanded translations. It's kind of a little bit like the Living Bible, but at times it's more like the Amplified Bible, where you're given a smorgasbord of things that you could choose from as possible translations for one word. And so the same thing occurs here. You have that expansion, you have interpretation, and you have application, all those things occurring. So the translation, especially of that which is outside the Pentateuch, outside the Torah, may have a lot of Targumic influence. And what we see there may not be the evidence of a Hebrew text difference, but rather of a Targumic tradition that is being added to the text. So there's a lot of debate still going on there. A lot of examination that still needs to be done. If some of you want to go on from your MDiv to a THM, go on to a doctor's degree, there's room for doctoral dissertations, writing on the Targumic influence on the Septuagint. There's room for a lot of examination. And there's things that can be done here that would help clarify the issue of the history of the text and exactly what we're looking at Qumran. What are these texts? Why the differences? What accounts for any differences in the text? But again, as Al Walters mentioned in the first essay in the Face of Old Testament Studies, the predominant text type at the Dead Sea Scrolls sites, all of the different scrolls, whether it's Masada, Nahal Hever, whether it's Muraba'at, whether it's Qumran or wherever, the dominant text type is the proto-masoretic type. That means that the Masoretic text which we now have is closer to the vast majority of the manuscripts found at Qumran. That's very different than when I was in seminary and I was told that it was the Septuagint that was the closest text to the Qumran scrolls. And now look at it. After much study, after a half century of examination, the world's leading experts are saying only 5% of the Qumran biblical manuscripts are directly related to the Septuagint at this point in time. If we were to take the non-aligned texts, which are at 35%, and we were to take and divide that co-equally between Septuagint, and between Masoretic texts, and that would be leaving out the Samaritan. But obviously the Samaritan only applies to the pentateuchal books. But if we were to take that and divide it co-equally, still the proto-masoretic text would dominate and would be a majority. So today it's totally turned around. The Septuagint is no longer looked at as being as viable a text, as valued a text as it once was. All that's remaining is the issue of then why do the New Testament writers choose to cite the Septuagint in 80% of their quotations from the Old Testament? And we have to be careful about that argumentation, because just because they use the Septuagint doesn't validate the Septuagint's translation as being inspired. Because the New Testament also cites from the book of Enoch, an apocryphal book. It also cites from pagan poets. And we're not claiming inspiration for any of those things either, just because they're cited or quoted. So there's a lot to be done there, but a very fascinating area. Yes?
Are you saying that the mixing of the targum influence for the Septuagint was, that's the popular view or the accepted view, or?
Okay, the question is, did I say that the mixing of the Targum influence in with the Septuagint, is that the going view, is the popular view, is the accepted view? No, it's only that which is currently being debated and examined and looked at, because people have begun to realize that there's similarity between those two characteristics, the special like double translation and many other aspects. There are similarities between the nature of the Septuagint translation and the nature of the Targums. And it's yet to be studied completely. That's why I said if you can go on to a doctor's degree and do a full examination, there's plenty of room to do doctoral dissertations in this area. Okay? Yes?
You spoke a little bit about how it's found in the New Testament.
Yes.
Do you have a section in here that talks about that, about how the Old Testament is used?
No, that's the question is, do I have a section here in the syllabus that deals with New Testament use of the Old Testament? No, I do not. In Old Testament introduction, I do not cover that. That's left for New Testament introduction for Dr. Thomas to cover that as he desires, because it's in New Testament. If you take any of my classes, like in the exegesis of Psalms, we do deal with that. We dealt with it yesterday in Psalm 53 and how Romans chapter 3 used it. But in here, that's not our purpose to cover it here. Okay, any other questions? Yes?
The Qumran scrolls date to?
Okay, what are the dates of the Qumran scrolls? The Qumran scrolls, the earliest date for the Qumran scrolls is placed at around 300 BC. It's possible that some of the earliest scrolls at Qumran predate the Septuagint. It's possible. It's difficult to demonstrate and prove. The most recent scrolls at Qumran come down all the way to almost AD 70. Remember, Qumran was destroyed by the Romans shortly after AD 70, and so there's potential that there were scrolls there that we found that were produced very shortly before that. Using carbon dating methodology and using paleographic dating methodology and using the examination of the parchments on which the scrolls are written have led to various dates given, but they're very consistent with a range between, say, 100 AD, which is a little bit extreme because it was destroyed before then, but from 100 AD to about 300 BC is the proper range. The question of which manuscripts were produced when is another issue that has not been totally settled or published. And hopefully in the future those will be published with the best dates for each individual manuscript, so we have a better history of the transmission. Okay, anyone else? All right, let's go on then. Let's take a look at a couple of these manuscripts. This is a manuscript found in the Nahal Hever cave, still considered among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And you can see there it's written in the Jewish script. Nahal Hever is between Masada and Ein Gedi. It's quite a bit south of Qumran. Notice Qumran is up there on the northwest corner of the Dead Sea. And if we were to take a look at the section here, we have Mi Yagur Be'achaleka, Mi Tamim, Upoel, Tzedek, Wedover. This is from Psalm 15. It's who shall abide or who shall dwell temporarily. It's the idea of to reside temporarily, overnight, gur, in your tent. Who, etc., goes on to ask who can abide permanently, more permanently, on your holy mountain. And then it talks about, well, this is the answer, the one who is perfect or upright, tamim, the one who does righteousness, upoel tzedek, the one who speaks truth in his heart. And so as we compare this script and we look at it, excuse me, back up here a minute where you can see that Psalm 15 verses 1 to 2, what we have of this psalm is identical to what's in the Masoretic text. So for this psalm, for what we have of it, and it's a short psalm, we can pretty confidently declare that this is in agreement with the proto-masoretic text. There's not one difference in what we have of it that is something different than what we have in the Masoretic text currently. And we look at this text, which is from Leviticus, 4Q Paleo-LEV. What does the 4 stand for? Cave number 4. What's the Q? That's the location at Qumran. What's the Paleo stand for? The script. Paleo-Hebrew script. It's a different script than the manuscript we just looked at. The one we just looked at looks like our modern Hebrew. It's Aramaic script brought back from the exile. It is what is now called, in political correctness, Jewish script. And this is the Paleo-Hebrew script. The Paleo-Hebrew script is the original script that the scriptures were written in. The scriptures were not in the modern Hebrew script until after the exile. So anything written prior to that time, which includes the entire Pentateuch, includes many other things. Many of the Psalms are pre-exilic. All those would have been written in this Paleo-Hebrew script. And so this Paleo-Hebrew script of what book? Leviticus. LEV stands for Leviticus. So it is the Paleo-Hebrew, it is a Paleo-Hebrew script, manuscript of Leviticus, found at Qumran in cave number 4. That's what all that symbolism stands for. The very top there is the word Yisrael. You can see I've given you the square script, the Jewish script, and you can look at it there in the Hebrew, Paleo-Hebrew script and see the difference. And that's in Leviticus 7:34. Benau, his sons, 7:35. Asher is included in 7:36. Notice that you have a dot before and after the words. Here's the dot there before Yisrael. Here's the dot before Benau and after. The dot before Asher, the dot after. You look down in the other parts here, you see dots also before and after words. Those are word dividers. This was something else that when I was in seminary, I was taught that there were no word dividers in ancient Hebrew manuscripts. That they were continuous Hebrew without a break, no word spaces. And therefore, I was taught when I was in seminary that then the Hebrew text that we have, the Masoretic text, is hypothetical. It is guessing by the Masoretes because the manuscripts originally never were given in words. They were not broken up with spaces between words. So that then that allowed the Masoretes to make many errors, many mistakes in dividing the words improperly and then ending up with a different text. And so it was very popular at that time, and you go back to the Journal of Biblical Literature, you go back to many of the journals of that time, and you'll find out that many of the articles were redividing the Hebrew text to try to find different readings that were supposed to be original readings, rather than the erroneous text division of the Masoretes. Well, now we have evidence that dominates. There are no samples of biblical texts in Hebrew that are continuous script. That was a figment of imagination that even evangelicals adopted. Why? Because they saw the old Septuagint manuscripts like Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, Alexandrinus, those unsealed manuscripts in the capital Greek letters with no word divisions or word breaks, and they just extrapolated that back and said, well, he must have done that because the Hebrew didn't make a division. Now with the Qumran scrolls from 1947 and following, we know for certain. In fact, even the text we found that dates back to 600 to 700 BC at Ketef Hinnom, the silver amulet that includes the Numbers chapter 6 prayer or blessing of Aaron, has word dividers. We look at many other things. The Mesha inscription from Moab. We look at the Tel Dan stela at Dan. And all of these have word dividers. We look at the Siloam Tunnel inscription from the time of Hezekiah, word dividers. Everywhere we find the word dividers. So that means that the scholars were all wrong about that. And we were taught the wrong things. And all that guessing about the text and all those conjectures about how to read the text and how to redivide the text were based upon very subjective, non-scientific, historically inaccurate approaches and understandings of what the Hebrew text was. Now, something else you have to watch out for. I love looking at pictures of text. I took this picture out of a volume that was edited by Frank Moore Cross and Shemaryahu Talmon on Qumran and the Hebrew Bible. And it was published with a title that said, these are fragments, plural, these are fragments of the Leviticus scroll found in Cave 4. So I decided to test it out. I looked at the scroll, I looked at these fragments, and I began to check them out. And I saw here you have a yod and a waw, and you have b'nai over there on the right-hand side, and I went through others here. Down here, you have 2 dots here on either side, and this is a kaf and a lamed. That's all, kol. And as you begin looking through these and you check out the various words, it's very fascinating. You can prove and demonstrate by computer searches that this is from Leviticus. But this fragment is not found, nothing of this is found anywhere in Leviticus. No combination of words or forms is found anywhere in the book of Leviticus. Therefore, this fragment doesn't belong here. And it has been photographed, and perhaps the one who photographed it didn't intend it to be said that it was Leviticus. Perhaps it was just laid side by side to show here's a possible combination or connection, as in a crossword, as in a jigsaw puzzle, putting it together. But it's not part of it. And I'm certain by now they've made certain this second fragment's identified somewhere else, and I just haven't found out where they've put it yet. I've done several searches, didn't find it anywhere in the Pentateuch. And usually this type of script is either from the Pentateuch or from Job. And I haven't done a search on Job. Maybe it's a fragment from Job. But it's very fascinating to me that, you have to, when you see pictures of things, you have to question it. You have to say, is this true, or are they just pulling the wool over my eyes? And I've made a practice of doing that. And I don't know if I mentioned it here before, but one time I was reading a book by James Sanders on the Dead Sea Psalm scroll, and I was looking at the photographs. I found some of the photographs are mislabeled, and some of the photographs had been inverted and published wrong direction. So I sent a letter to him and to the publisher, and he sent me back a packet of photographs that were rightly printed. And then I did that with another publisher, and they sent me 6 of their latest books. I did it with the Biblical Archaeology Review when they published a picture inside one of the churches in Jerusalem. And it was the church where Christ's body was supposedly laid and supposed to be over his tomb. And I looked at that picture and I said, it's wrong. It is reversed. The sunlight's coming in at the wrong angle for the time of year they say they took the picture and for the location of the church and its orientation. The statue of Christ before the monument, they show him with his left hand raised in blessing. The left hand's never raised in blessing. That's the hand of cursing. The right hand's the one that's used for that. And then the inscriptional evidence. The Latin inscription is inverted. And I went through 4 or 5 different levels of evidence that would show and prove that this had been reversed. And they wrote back. In fact, they put it, you can find it in one of the bars, where they put it in my letter to the editor. They put it in there, and then they said at the bottom that Mr. Barrick is correct, and we apologize for any lack of sleep he got while he was reading this in Bangladesh. So, but I don't accept everything I see or hear. I test it. And when I'm reading things and they say this is a manuscript of such and such, I will read it and find out. And I think that's a good thing for all of us to remember. Let's double check, make certain our evidence is correct. This should not have been published with that heading. It's one fragment of the Leviticus scroll with another fragment from somewhere else. It's not fragments from the Leviticus scroll. Steve?
Do you give the same attention to our papers?
Yes, I do. All right. All right, let's go to the next part here. We're going to move on. I want to talk to you about some of the other evidences. We talked here about the Qumran manuscripts. Let's move to the Samaritan Pentateuch. What you see here is a photographic reproduction of a page from the Samaritan Pentateuch, and it is from Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 1 and following. Starts right up there at the top, and it says, "And it shall be, if you indeed listen to the voice of Yahweh your God, to be certain to do all of his commandments, which he has commanded you this day," etc. That's all, that's all up there in the text. And I thought I had put something up here to show you, but this is the wow, the hey, yod, hey. Notice the dot for the word divider, and then the aleph and mem, and a dot for the word divider, and then sheen, mem, and there's the ayin. You can always see the ayin. It looks like a triangle there. It's representing the eye. Ayin is eye. And so it takes that form. It's like the Greek delta almost, except it's inverted. And then the dot there. And notice then that the wow, the holem wow in shamoah is not there. It's not written. So they just put shamoah. It's a shortened form of the O vowel. And then from there you have the tau, the sheen, the mem, and the ayin of tishmeh, the dot for the word divider, and the baith for the bakol. Here's the kof, the wow, and the lamed. The lamed you can always tell with that little top up on it there. That is like a flag flying up there at the top. But those are different types of script. Here's another example of the Samaritan Pentateuch. This is in 3 columns. This is what is called a Samaritan triglot. From Deuteronomy 31, 16 to 19, you have a Hebrew column, you have an Aramaic column, you have an Arabic column. Notice that the columns on the right-hand column has 2 letters together that are in a vertical column on the left-hand side to make certain this column is not confused with the column to the left of it. And the same thing here. But when you get to the 3rd column, since that's the last column, the margin is not so important. Confusion is not going to happen because there's not a 4th. It's not a quadriglot. It's a triglot. It's got 3 translations there. So you have the Hebrew text, the Aramaic text, and the Arabic text written in Samaritan Hebrew script, which is an adaptation of the Paleo-Hebrew script. In verse 16 we have, "And Yahweh said to Moses." And as you look at this, you can see as it goes across, and here you have the mem of Moshe, the sheen and the hay. Notice the space between the mem, the sheen, and the hay and Moses. In other words, doing that movement, they didn't bother to put the whole word over there. They just consistently gave the 2 letters, and so it can break into the middle of a word. And this whole section, as you look at it here, "And the Lord said unto Moses, Behold, you are about to lie down with your fathers." In other words, you're about to die. "And this people shall rise up and shall commit adultery, shall fornicate after strange gods of the land, which they came into here in its midst, and they have departed from me, and they have violated my covenant which I made with them, which I have cut with them." I've marked the kaf and comets here because of the fact that in the text as we have it within the Samaritan Pentateuch, that is spelled out just like in the Qumran text, a kaf and hay, so that you can tell the difference between one and the other. There's the name Yahweh right up here. Notice the dots on either side of it. This will be significant because this is the equivalent of the Paleo-Hebrew script instead of the Samaritan Paleo-Hebrew script. In other words, when the name Yahweh, the covenant name, is written, whether it is in Hebrew at Qumran, whether it is in Greek among the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Greek Septuagint, or whether it is in the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Paleo-Hebrew script is used for the Tetragrammaton in inserting the 4-letter name of the covenant God. We'll be observing that. Now let's talk about the use of ancient translations. And I want you to be careful to get these notes down at this point to make certain you list each of these. because I will be asking you about this on a future quiz, and if not in a quiz, it will definitely be in the final exam. And I hope you all caught the term definitely. Okay? The first point in the use of ancient translations. You must first confirm the reading of that translation, whether it's the Samaritan Pentateuch, whether it is the Greek Septuagint, the Latin Vulgate, the Syriac Peshitta, the ancient Arabic or Ethiopic, no matter what it is, you've got to confirm that that is the reading. Just to make the statement, well, this is what the Septuagint says, is inadequate. First of all, why are you saying the Septuagint says? Well, I picked up the Septuagint in the library or off my shelf, or that parallel column edition that is sold in the bookstores. And that's the Septuagint, isn't it? Yes, it says Septuagint on the outside, but it's probably Rolfe's edition, Alfred Rolfe, and it is a manual edition. It's not a text critical edition, and it's based primarily on Codex Alexandrinus. So really what you're saying is that either Codex Alexandrinus, among all the hundreds and thousands of Greek manuscripts of the Old Testament, or Rolfe's opinion as an individual editor has this. You're not yet proving that the entire Septuagint supports it. You have to confirm that reading by going to the text critical editions and looking at all the manuscript evidence to find out if that's a minority reading, a singular, unique reading, a personal reading that is chosen out of prejudice by the editor in modern times, or what it is. You have to demonstrate there's evidence for it. Remember, as we looked at 1 Samuel chapter 6, and we looked there at the ark, and we went to the different manuscripts, we went to the Cambridge Septuagint to demonstrate and look at all the manuscript evidence for the Septuagint to make certain that we could be firm on what was in the Septuagint edition by Rolfe's, whether it had 50,000, 70 people or not. Well, this is the first step. You have to confirm. So in essence, if you're going to do textual criticism and you're going to refer to the versions, the ancient versions, you have to do textual criticism of each version individually before you can dogmatically say or with confidence say, yes, this is the weight of Septuagint evidence or the weight of Vulgate evidence. The second point is the exegetical system and the translation technique must be understood, identified, and accounted for. We talked earlier about the possible targumic influence on the translation of the Greek Septuagint. We need to look at the differences between, say, the translation of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses in the Septuagint, as opposed to the remaining books of the Septuagint. They were different translators, and they followed different techniques. Some of them are very free and paraphrastic, others are very literal. It varies from book to book. So we must study the exegetical system or the interpretive methodology, the system of hermeneutics of the translators. Translation involves interpretation. You have to understand what the text says, and you must convey that understanding accurately into a second language. And to do that, there's a degree of interpretation. And when we allow our interpretation to affect that, then we end up with perhaps a problem. For example, the first edition of the New International Version, the NIV, in Philippians chapter 3, talking about the upward calling, translated in a way that was very clear that the translator or translators or the translation committee believed that it was a reference to the rapture. And their translation showed that. All right? Now that's interpretive. And the same phraseology there could be taken a number of ways. It might not refer to the rapture. So that translation was exposing the interpretation of the translators. Whether that interpretation was correct or not is not the question. The question is it an accurate translation free of individual interpretation? It was not. And in the next edition, second or third edition, it was changed to where it was more literal and left it open. It was not so obviously interpretive anymore. That's exactly what you have to watch out for in the ancient versions. The Samaritan Pentateuch would take any possible reference to the area of Shechem, to Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, even a vague, veiled reference that no one else would possibly ever see, and is perhaps even allegorical, and insert it into the text to demonstrate and prove that Mount Gerizim was the true place to worship God, not Mount Zion, not Mount Moriah, not the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, but Gerizim near Shechem. And that's one of the theological biases of the Samaritan Pentateuch. That's one of many. So we have to know that. The translation technique, were they literal or not? How literal were they? Fascinating thing in Genesis chapter 1 is that when you look there and you see that in the beginning were the heavens and the earth, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void. That word was, hayatah, is translated in such a way to demonstrate that it is a static stative, not a dynamic stative. It's not becoming. It did not become waste and void. That's the error of the gap theory, is it interprets the Hebrew wrongly. But notice how the Septuagint supports that interpretation of the text by using a form of eimi rather than genomai. If it meant become, they would have used genomai. And the Septuagint translators in Genesis are very consistent. When you have the imperfect of haya, the verb to be, it's translated with genomai, meaning become. When you have the perfect of haya, to be, they use eimi in the Greek, the word be. So that if you understand that, then you can go through the Pentateuch and you can understand what they're looking at. And if there's a disagreement between the Masoretic text and the Greek text, you can hypothesize then what would have been the Hebrew had the Hebrew been a different base for their translation, because you understand how they treated the haya, stative verb, in the perfect and imperfect. They were very consistent. And so you watch for those techniques and try to understand them. Third point is the equivalence elsewhere in the translation must be carefully analyzed and looked at. This is one of my favorite things about Genesis chapter 37 and the so-called coat of many colors. The Hebrew does not say that. It has nothing about a coat of many colors. That is a mythological legend imposed upon the text as the result of mistranslation by the Vulgate and the Septuagint that is propagated in our Sunday schools ad nauseum. All right? The Hebrew says it's a long-sleeved garment. The interesting thing is, if you did any checking on this, to check against the Septuagint and the Vulgate, you find out that the same Hebrew phrase is used elsewhere. For example, in Psalm 45. And amazingly, the Septuagint translates it correctly there rather than as a many-colored garment. And so if we check all of these things and we find something that's so different, and we say, why did the Septuagint do this? Why did the Vulgate follow the Septuagint in this? And we go and look elsewhere, we find out that they are inconsistent. These translations are inconsistent. And we find out that elsewhere they were consistent. So that leads to another question. Where did this come from? Where did this come from? It could be a Targumic expansion or addition. It could be a Jewish legend. They often enhance things like that. And so, I don't know about you, but I like teaching my kids what the truth is in Scripture. And so when we got to Genesis 37 and the coat of many colors, I just told them, in spite of the song by Dolly Parton, which is so popular, in spite of all the other things, this is not a many-colored coat. It was just a very fancy coat, long-sleeved, formal garment that was given as a gift, and I taught my children that. They didn't learn that it was many-colored except when they went to Sunday school and heard someone teach it wrongly. All right? The fourth point. Textual probability and linguistic plausibility in the Hebrew context. What do I mean by that? Well, if we study a writer like Moses, for example, and we understand his normal vocabulary and his normal grammar, first of all, he spoke and wrote Hebrew in a certain period of time, a period of history that had a dialect of Hebrew that was different than later periods of time. There are distinct differences at times between the languages in different eras in the Old Testament. And it doesn't mean there's major differences to where they could not understand one another, or where someone living in the time of Malachi would have difficulty understanding the Pentateuch. That's not true at all. It was not that vast of a difference. That's extrapolating another figment of people's imaginations into it, to think that it's so vastly different. There have been so many changes in the language that it required some textual updating in the time of Ezra to put it into modern Hebrew so that people in 400 BC would understand it. There's no such thing. In fact, if that really happened, then they did a very, very poor job, because of all the areas that needed textual updating that were outdated, were anachronistic type of Hebrew of that time. They left 80% of it unchanged. 80% of that older dialect is unchanged. So it was a very incomplete and sloppy job if it was done, and I don't think it was done. I think it's just a misunderstanding of what the text says and the history of the text and the history of the language. But that's what we mean by textual probability and linguistic plausibility, is what was the language being spoken by the writer, what was the phraseology and the normal vocabulary he used, and then when we try to say, okay, this translation, the Septuagint, the Vulgate, or whatever, is based upon a different Hebrew text, and we hypothesize what the Hebrew text was, and we give that. That's called a retroversion. It's retro. You're retrofitting. You're going from the Greek back to the hypothetical Hebrew base. When you give that hypothetical Hebrew base, that Hebrew base has to match what is his normal vocabulary and grammar. If it violates and sounds totally un-Mosaic, it's probably the wrong retroversion. So we have to watch that very carefully. Question, Steve?
How do the textual updating adherents respond to that argument you gave about the large amount of anachronistic Hebrew phrases that would be updated?
All right. How do those who support textual updating respond to my comment about the fact that the largest amount of potentially updatable text was not updated? They don't have really an answer for that. Basically, the response I've gotten is that, well, they only changed those things which were significant or important in a particular context to make certain that it was properly understood, and others were in context that might have been understood clearly without the change. But they will also admit quite openly that they just don't know why it wasn't done more completely. But the interesting thing is that the examples of textual updating are usually limited to texts where someone says, I have difficulty understanding this text and why it reads this way, because of a prior concept or presupposition. For example, on the Chaldeans, in Genesis 11, 28 through 31, someone would come to that and say, I don't understand how the Chaldeans could be mentioned in Genesis. It seems way too early. The Assyrian documents don't mention the Chaldeans until the 7th or 8th centuries BC. So obviously the Chaldeans didn't exist then, so they'd have to have been added after that period of time. Well, that is a presupposition that the Assyrian documents are complete, are accurate, and are evidence of absence of the Chaldeans in a prior period of time. And if you take that way, it's really inconsistent, because then you also have to strike out all the pharaohs of ancient Egypt in the patriarchal times, because the Assyrian documents only mention 3 contemporary pharaohs. So, and Kenneth Kitchen brought that out, pointed out that you need to watch that. So usually it's because we have come to a text that we say is a problem text. We have difficulties interpreting it. We don't quite understand it, and we might have already a presupposition that conforms the text to extra-biblical literature as being of a higher authority. And therefore, we feel free then to say, well, the text has been changed and updated. This whole issue goes clear back to Augustine. Augustine had the same answer for differences between Septuagint and the Hebrew text in a text like the genealogy of Genesis chapter 5. He said, well, obviously the Septuagint translators are inspired by the Holy Spirit to correct the Hebrew that we have. Well, that's the view of King James only, that says the King James Version corrects the Greek and Hebrew as of 1611. All right? So textual probability and linguistic plausibility in the Hebrew context. You always have to say, okay, now, if the version, if the Greek Septuagint, the Syriac Peshitta, or the Latin Vulgate, or the Samaritan Pentateuch appear to represent a different Hebrew text than the Hebrew text we have, then what Hebrew text do they represent? And then in hypothesizing what that Hebrew text was, back translating the Greek or Latin or Syriac to Hebrew, then we have to make certain we've chosen a Hebrew that has the Hebrew phrase or word or sentence that fits the style of that writer, so that it is a plausible linguistic representation. If it's in Moses, then it sounds like Moses. and it has textual probability, it fits the context, it fits the normal usage of Hebrew, then it is probable and plausible. Doesn't mean you've proven your case yet, but at least you've reached the plausibility level. So that is the fourth point. The fifth point is then to go from that to find support from other texts and other translations. In other words, so you've resolved the issue of the coat of many colors in Genesis chapter 37. You must go to other passages within the text to find that out. You must go to other versions and translations to support it, especially for hypothesizing a change in text. But all of these have to be then supported. You have to be broad about it. Like we did in 1 Samuel, when we were looking there at 50,070, we checked all the ancient versions to see what they all did, so that we weren't depending only on the Septuagint witness. We checked the Vulgate, we checked the Syriac Peshitta as well. And we found that all four of the major ancient translations supported what the Hebrew text had. And therefore we did not propose any emendation of the text. Okay? Everyone clear on these 5 principles, these guidelines for use of ancient translations? Let me summarize them one more time. Number 1, confirmation of the reading. Number 2, the exegetical system and translation technique must be considered. Number 3, we must look at equivalence elsewhere in that same version, that same translation. Number 4, we must consider textual probability and linguistic plausibility in the Hebrew context of what we are proposing as a new Hebrew reading. And lastly, we must have support from other texts and translations. Any questions on that? Okay, let's move on then. Let's take a look at the examples here of the Greek Septuagint, and then we'll be taking a break here in a minute. Notice how the Greek here is written in capital uncial scripts. These are unsealed manuscripts of the Greek. These are chopped up. They're taken out of the book by Wertwein. And what they did is they took photographs and they chopped up the photographs so they could parallel the photographs of several different passages in one place. And this is Codex Sinaiticus. The date of Codex Sinaiticus is 375 to 400 AD. It's the text that Count Tischendorf found at St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai Peninsula in the 1800s when he was visiting there. And got up in the middle of the night, was hungry, wanted a snack, went to the kitchen, asked the cook for some food, and he got some tea and some bread, and he noticed that the cook was wrapping the bread in an old manuscript, torn from a codex, from a book, and he asked if he could take that to his room, and he took it, and he spent all night examining it, and was totally convinced it was a very old biblical manuscript. Actually, it was from the book of Genesis, and it was from the Codex Sinaiticus. And the next morning he went back and he made them promise not to do anything else with that codex that way. To preserve it was very important, it was very significant, it was very old, and they finally agreed to do so. And after several trips back to try to purchase it from them, he finally succeeded in purchasing it for a very small fee in comparison to what it is worth. And in that codex, there's the books of Maccabees, for example. That tells you which canon is being used in this codex. Sean?
What's missing in Sinaiticus?
What's missing in Sinaiticus?
I mean, if they were
First few leaves of Genesis and the last few leaves of Revelation. Okay, who's going to answer the question about what canon is being used here? Alexandrian canon, because it includes the apocryphal books. All right. Jeremiah 9, 2 to 3 and 9 to 10 is in the second 2 there in the middle. In the English, that'd be 9, 3 to 4 and 10 to 11. And then the book of Tobit at the bottom. And so you can see it's just it's photographed and chopped up here. And in actuality, Codex Sinaiticus has 4 columns of text. So you're only getting 2 of the columns here. And here as you look at it, I've given you the preceding here, kai enetenan tein glosson auton host taxon. And the ta here is where the previous line left off, and the xon begins this line. That tells you something. When you reach the end of the line, you just wrap the word around. And you don't put a break there for the word, and you break the word right in the middle. It doesn't matter where you're at. You just keep going. This is the scriptua continua that we were taught in seminary. It was true of the Hebrew as well. Just keeps going. On and on, like the Energizer Bunny. Just goes, keeps rapping. And here's talking about the tongue of the false tongue that is drawn like a bow. And here we have the truth being mutilated. Here, pistis. When we look at that in the Hebrew, it's le'emunah, which usually is translated as truth. And at the end there, I've got a question mark, because when you end this with egnoson, and notice there seems to be a dot here, and there seems to be a dot up here. Those dots may indicate the end of the verse. But you have another dot in here. It makes sense to break a word, but it doesn't break the verse. So occasionally there are dots in here that you don't understand why they're there. You don't know if maybe it just might be to space things out a little bit to make the columns a little bit more regular, or why it's there. But at the end here, it goes on to go into a reading that is not declares the Lord. Ne'um Yahweh is not found here. It's not translated by the Septuagint here in Jeremiah 9, 3-4. So you have part of the Hebrew text ignored by the translator. Here's another example, and this is from Codex Vaticanus, and it has 3 columns. Now, I want to tell you a clue about how you can impress your friends and family when you visit the museums and you look at the codexes of the Septuagint. And that is, you can tell at a distance which codex it is by how many columns on a page. All right? It's very simple to remember. There are 3 major codexes. Alexandrinus begins with an A and is symbolized by an A. Vaticanus begins with a V, but it's symbolized by a B. Okay? So A and B manuscripts are Alexandrinus and Vaticanus. Sinaiticus is usually symbolized with an aleph, a Hebrew aleph, or also a capital S for Sinaiticus. So ABS, A, 2 columns, B, 3 columns, S, 4 columns, 2, 3, 4 in alphabetical order. ABS, 2, 3, 4. You look at this, there are 3 columns. It is Codex Vaticanus. If it had 2 columns on a page, it would be Codex Alexandrinus. Okay, so there's a way to impress people right there. You can tell them, oh, I see that over there. That must be Codex Sinaiticus. And you say, you can't even read the Greek yet. How can you tell that? Because it's got 4 columns on a page. All right? Then you get up there and find out that it's something that's not even biblical. Right? And the swelled head suddenly deflates. All right. Codex Vaticanus 325 to 350 AD. 1 Samuel 1744 to 1822, a very interesting section here in verse 45. And David said to the Alaphulan. Alaphulan. Alaphulan means literally another tribe. That is the way Philistine is represented in Samuel in the translation. Instead of saying Philistine, it says Alaphulan, a person of another tribe. So he said to the Philistine, to the Alaphulan, the other tribe guy, Su erke prosme, you come to me en Raphaya, or with a sword, kai en dorati, and with dagger, and en aspidi, with a spear, kago paruamai, but I come to you, prase, en anamati, kuriu. I come to you in the name of the Lord, Sabaoth, Lord of hosts. Notice they transliterated the Hebrew, which is exactly what we find in the Epistle of James. Okay? The God of the armies, Parataxios of Israel, Israel, hein onedisas, whom you are reproaching, whom you are, the idea here is speaking disrespectfully to today, Samaritan. Okay, and the reason I put Samaritan, highlighted that is not in the Hebrew text. In fact, in the Hebrew text, when it says today, it actually is placed with what follows, not with what's here in this verse. It goes with what follows. All right. This is a Zechariah scroll fragment from a Nachal Hever cave. Remember, we had Nachal Hever cave for Psalm 15 Hebrew fragment. Now we have a fragment here of Zechariah, And as we look at that here, we see this section here about at Hamath and in the regions around Tyre and Sidon where there is great wisdom. And notice what else you find. In that circle, what do you see? Yahweh. In the Greek text, it's inserted in Paleo-Hebrew script in the identical form we saw it in the Samaritan Hebrew text of the book of Exodus that we were looking at in that Samaritan triglot. Again, the Paleo-Hebrew script was used for the divine name Yahweh, the Tetragrammaton, both in the Hebrew and in the Samaritan and in the Greek text at Qumran. And this is the way you know this is a Jewish edition of the Septuagint. The Christian editions of the Septuagint always have kurios, never have Yahweh in Paleo-Hebrew script. There's another way to distinguish these two. The Christian Septuagint texts are always in codexes. They're always in book form. The Jewish Septuagint texts are always in scroll forms. And so we call that the Palestinian Septuagint and the Alexandrian Septuagint. The Alexandrian Septuagint is the Septuagint of the Christians, the Christian Septuagint, and the Palestinian Septuagint is the Septuagint of the Jews. Compare that with the canons we talked about of the Old Testament. Then the canon that adds the 14 books is the Christian canon versus the Jewish canon that does not have the 14 deuterocanonical books. So we, as not Catholics, more allied with the Protestants, we follow the Palestinian canon. We follow the Jewish canon of the Septuagint, not the Christian, quote-unquote, canon or Alexandrian canon of the Septuagint. Now, because of that, I would argue that we then ought to make certain that we use Yahweh in our text rather than Lord or Kurios. But we'll leave that for another day. Now, we were talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls. We had just looked at this sample of Zechariah chapter 9 in Greek, found there in Nachal Hever. And you note here that you have the unsealed script being used. It is capital letters. You'll notice also there are no word dividers. It seems to be characteristic of the Greek, and it's not a characteristic you find of the Hebrew that way. And it could be a lot of the reason why that you have people thinking that that should have been the way the Hebrew was as well. Again, a reminder of the Tetragrammaton of Yahweh being placed there in the red circle in the Paleo-Hebrew script. Very, very consistent characteristic of the Jewish Septuagint. To make certain that they did that with the name of God, the covenant name of God. Then the next one that we want to look at is the Syriac Peshitta. The Syriac Peshitta was translated by Christians of Jewish descent or Jewish converts into Christianity starting around AD 125. It was not completed or finalized until 400 AD. In the Pentateuch, it follows very literally the Hebrew. When you get out of the Pentateuch, it begins to follow the Aramaic targums, and you see a lot of expansions in the type of characteristics that you see in the targums. Now, Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic. If you learn Aramaic, you can read Syriac. All you have to do is learn the script, which is different from the Aramaic script. And then in the prophets and other books, it tended to then drift more and more to where it exhibited more and more dependence upon the Septuagint. Because this is a Christian translation, therefore it relied upon the so-called quote-unquote Christian authorized Bible of those days, the Greek Septuagint. So as you're going through the Syriac and you're doing textual criticism with the Syriac, you always have to ask yourself the question, which edition is this most closely to? Which edition influences it? How do I interpret this, and is it a viable additional witness to a different text, or is it merely just piling up one of the same kind of witness? If it agrees with the Septuagint and is clearly based upon the Septuagint, then you don't have two witnesses, the Septuagint and the Syriac, you have one witness, the Septuagint, which the Syriac depended upon. And oftentimes in the critical apparatus, the Syriac then symbol will be put in parentheses to show it's secondary and dependent upon the other. And those outside the parentheses are the primary witnesses, those that can be counted or looked at individually. In this Syriac script, this is Estrangela. There are 3 different scripts of the Syriac script. The Estrangela is one of the most beautiful, one of the oldest, and one that is very popular in the older manuscripts. This manuscript dates back to 464 AD, which is very close to the time of the completion of the full translation. It is the first translation of both Old and New Testament into a non-biblical language. Let me repeat that. The Syriac Peshitta is the first translation of both Old and New Testaments into a non-biblical language, Syriac. It's not Greek, which was used to translate the Old Testament into Greek, but the New Testament was written in Greek. And it's not Hebrew, and it's not Aramaic. It's a dialect of Aramaic. So it is the first translation of that kind. Exodus 13, 8 through 17 is what's up here on the screen. And at the very top there, you can see the Hu demetal hineid eved li Elohai written across the top there. And you can see Elohai, and you can see Maria, the second circle, the lower circle there is Maria, which we get the same as basic as the term as Moriah. And that is the word, the title that's used to replace the tetragrammaton, to replace Yahweh in the the Syriac translation. And it's where we get the word, like in Maranatha in the New Testament, as a greeting that Christians used. It literally means, may Mara, may the Lord come. And Mar, abbreviated, is Lord, whereas Maria is the fuller form used to replace the term Yahweh. So it's an extended form of Lord. So it's taking kurios, basically, from the Greek Septuagint and using in its place an expanded form. We did the same thing in Bangladesh in different translations. If we used Prabhu, that's Lord. If we use Shoda Prabhu, that's Yahweh. And it's adding eternal Lord to it. Or in the Persian, Koda is used for God, the equivalent of Elohim, and Kodabant is used as the equivalent for Yahweh, which means Almighty God. And so different terms are used in different languages in order to translate those two titles of deity to make a distinction. And that's the way it's done here. And in this text you have here the Passover text, and you have here, you shall make known to your son in that day, saying, because of this that the Lord has done for me, who brought us, when he brought me out from Egypt. This is why we're doing these things. This is why we're observing the Passover. And so this is the text that is found here. And then we take a look at the Hexapla. Origen's Hexapla, done between 230 to 240 AD. And the Hexapla was a means of trying to resolve the difficulty of having a multiplicity of Greek translations of the Old Testament, each one claiming to be authentic, each one claiming to be authoritative, in competition with each other, and yet variations between them, different translation styles. As varied as Aquila is very brutally literal, sometimes almost silly literal in the way he translated it, up to Theodosian's eloquent translations, and Symmachus's kind of in between, all of these different Greek translations. There were many more. And so Origen said, we've got to establish what the Septuagint should say. We've got to have one text that can be authorized by the church that we can stand up and say, this is the text to use, and don't use any other. We have to know what it says. So his suggestion was that we go back and compare all the Greek translations to the Hebrew. Comparing them to the Hebrew, then, he would find out which text was the most accurate. So the Hexapla is his study of the text of the Old Testament through, the Hexapla is because of 6 columns of text. In those 6 columns, he had a Hebrew transliterated text. He had a Septuagint text that was adopted from the current Septuagint of what was going on and what was being normally used in the churches of that time. And then he'd also have other columns. He had a column that included his translations. Actually, the fifth column was his translation, his recension or rendition of what it was to be. Aquila's translation was there, Symmachus's was there, and Theodosian's was there. Aquila's was done in 130 AD. It's the earliest of those Greek translations. It was intended for use by students. It was intended to be an aid to those who were studying Hebrew. It was not intended to be a translation that would be used in churches. It was not intended to be a translation you would use in study or in worship. It was merely that he wanted to provide something that would demonstrate what the Hebrew was and help someone learning Hebrew and reading the Hebrew understand what was there. And so it's very clear what the text was, because he used like the Greek soon, with, together with. He used that even for the eighth particle, the direct object marker in Hebrew. Now that same particle, a homonym of it, is a preposition meaning with. But it's not always that. But he always translates with soon. And so when you have Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, you have eighth Hashemayim, he has soon ha'uranoi. So he has there with. He created with the heavens and with the earth is his literal Greek translation. Now obviously that's what I call a silly translation. That's a nonsense translation. It makes no sense at all in Greek. It's not what the Hebrew says, but that's not what he intended it to be used for. He intended to identify the text, the Hebrew text. And that's why it is extremely valuable for textual critical studies. So we're not going to do like the NIV translators did, just throw out Aquila completely and say it's worthless for consideration. Sure, it's a poor translation, but it's a superb example of preservation of the Hebrew text. And therefore it ought to be kept, and we ought to look at it, and we ought to consult Aquila. Symmachus, AD 170, Theodosian, AD 200, as the dates there for the remaining ones. So putting all these together, and the edition that you see up here is by Fields. He put these all together in a full set of volumes where he could give all the surviving readings, because Origen's Hexapla does not totally survive in any one manuscript. In fact, it's fragmentary. In fact, there's areas of it where we have parts totally missing. Much of it that has been preserved in what is called the Syriac Hexapla, which was a Syriac translation of Origen's Hexapla from Greek into the Syriac language. And more of that has survived than anything else. And then he has all these notes that have to do with the textual criticism of it. I've blown it up here so you can see Genesis 49, verse 10, a little bit more closely, where he talks about ad ki yavo Shiloh, until Shiloh comes. And Fields gives a translation of the Hebrew into Latin. Asque dum veneret Shiloh. Notice he says it's Shiloh. He doesn't interpret it otherwise, because that is the obvious meaning of the Hebrew by itself and the obvious meaning taken through history. Then he gives Origen's fifth column and Theodosian as heos ean, elthe ta apokemena auto, until he comes to whom it belongs. And then Aquila, heos an elthe and ... because Aquila has Shiloh, the literal. So that tells you that Theodosian was part of this controversy very early on. The controversy over what Genesis 49:10 says started in the early church. And it started in the early church because the Jews began to change their view and translation of this passage, because the way the Christians took it as Messiah. Now, it can be demonstrated and proven that the older rabbis also took this as a reference to Messiah, and Shiloh as a title of the Messiah. But in order to get away from it, they're the ones who began instigating until he comes to whom it belongs, so they could get away from a title of Messiah. But the Masorah have demonstrated time and time again here that Shiloh is to be retained, and retained as a title. And it's fascinating to watch, because in the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensis text that we have in the Masorah Parva, they altered the Masorah from Biblia Hebraica Kittel. And there's some messing around here with the Masora Parva in order to try to support the later Theodosianic translation and what is used in many English translations today. And it's a little bit of dishonesty and scholarship going on there. Down here is some of his notes about it, where he talks about Eusebius making a note about this in his discussions and indicating that it was a debate in the early church in which Symmachus and Theodotion disagreed with each other on how this should be translated. So it's a long-standing issue, as long-standing as the issue over the translation of the Virgin in Isaiah 7:14. All right? And then let's go on down here. That's just to show you the notes there. We don't need to look at all those. And this is looking at some of the pictures of the manuscripts with regard to Genesis 49:10 and the Masora Parva in the margin. And you can see here how it's expanded and up. And all the way through here, it is the indication that Shiloh is to be maintained as it is. There's a circule here in the text to indicate that Shiloh is to be retained and maintained as is. And there are notes in the margin to indicate that this is a proper name. And therefore, I object to the translation until he comes to whom it belongs. I think that is a theological slippage at work. And it is a title of deity. And there's many things that can be talked about here and argued about. But in the preliminary and interim report of the Hebrew Old Testament Text Project, which is in the library, excellent. There's 5 volumes there. They've gone through and done a study of all the major textual variants in the Hebrew Old Testament. And on those pages, they'll go through, for example, and you can see I've written on here, excellent. On 49:10, you have the Hebrew given. You have a rating given as to the certainty for the reading, and a certainty for the Hebrew. A translation in English, a translation in French, then an alternate reading provided by those who think it should read otherwise. He comes to whom it belongs, Yavo Shelo, instead of using Shiloh. Notice the yod up there makes a big difference. And in some places, they go on to have greater discussion, more discussion of it. They've come under a lot of criticism because of being supposedly overly conservative in their handling of the Hebrew text. Coming down on the side of the Masoretic text too much of the time. They support the Masoretic text over 90% of the time in the problems that they face. So it's gained a lot of criticism, but it's standing, and it's lasting, it's surviving, and it's going through some new additions. And it's a valuable tool for you if you want to take a look at it. It's kind of like having a textual commentary for the New Testament. Now you have a textual commentary for the Old Testament, and the revisions of this are going to expand that and make it in greater detail. And then Quinta edition of the Biblia Hebraica that's coming out is going to also have a textual commentary. So you'll have 2 sources of textual commentaries where you can go to find out what the experts are saying about various readings in the Hebrew text. Here's the rest of it here. Gives the RSV, the Jerusalem Bible, and Luther's German. The Jerusalem Bible was originally done in French. That's why you see it there in French, and it's the first edition has it that way. Later editions do not necessarily read the same. And then the FAC area there is referring back to an introductory section where they talk about the reasons for textual changes or textual variants. And you go back to look at causes 5, 4, and 8 that the committee has given. And then they go through and discuss a third reading, Yuvah Shiloh, tribute will be brought to him, represented in the NEB, the second edition of the Jerusalem Bible in French. And then the fact there that is involved, the reasons, the principle involved. The remark that Shiloh is the name of a son of Judah, and although in all these places traditional spelling is Shelah, the son of Judah is seen as the father of the inhabitants of Shiloh. And then you have the committee's decision, translated as Shiloh comes. That's their ultimate decision. Now that decision was reached by a committee of scholars, including Barthélemy and others from both sides of the Atlantic, men who are not evangelicals, men who do not have a theological axe to grind. and they agree that it should be translated as Shiloh. And I think that we'll see some translations eventually coming around to this as more of this is written on, more of the evidence is looked at, and more is exposed about what's gone on behind the scenes and even changing the Masora Parva and what parts of the Masora Parva have been published in the various editions and omitted in an attempt to try to support that Jewish view that became part of Theodosian's translation. Yes?
Is this available for the entire Old Testament?
For the entire Old Testament, 5 volumes. 5 paperback volumes down the library. The newer edition coming out is going to be 2 large hardback volumes. So one of the resources you can go to in dealing with it. Okay, this is the example of the Hexapla in what has been a palimpsest manuscript. Search in there for the word. Palimpsest means it's written again. It's been scraped and then written over the top of. So you see here various scripts here down in the margin. If you take a close look at that, that's upside down. So they've taken and scraped and erased a manuscript as much as possible, turned it over, and then reused it to do this manuscript because parchment is precious. And so if you have one writing that's not valuable enough to keep and you need parchment for something more important, then you go scrape that one and clean it as much as you can and then write over the top of it. Sometimes it's hard to read things, and sometimes it's interesting to look to see what was there. But this is the Milan Hexapla, it's called, from the 9th to 11th centuries AD. Psalm 27. And here's a transliteration and reorganization of it all in readable columns, giving the Masoretic text, which would not be there. It's not in the Hexapla. This is given for reference in the modern reprinting of this. This column is what you find in Origen's Hexapla. And so you can see here that ki is transliterated, shama, shmas, transliterated, to show what the Hebrew pronunciation, you get a clue here, is what the Hebrew pronunciation was by Origen, whether it was Gentile pronunciation or Hebrew pronunciation, we don't know for certain, but that was his pronunciation in 230 AD of these words. And then you have Aquila's column, Symmachus's, the Septuagint column, which is normally over here, and Quinta, the 5th column, is Origen's column. And that's what we mean by the Hexapla being arranged in that fashion. Now, one of the symbols used in the Hexapla is given to you in your study guide for the final exam at the back of the syllabus. You may have difficulty finding it, so I decided I would let you in on it now so you can copy the information down. It's called an asterisk or asterixis. It is an X with a dot in each of the 4 quadrants. So it looks almost like a star. It's an X with a dot in each of the 4 quadrants. That asterisk or asteriscus means that it marks words in the original text which are lacking in the Septuagint, but now borrowed by Origen from another version, whether it's from Theodosian or Symmachus, and inserted into the Septuagint column, placed between the asterisk and the metabolus. The metabilis there looks like the nail that's at an angle, the tack there at the end. But the asterisk is what signals, and it signals words that were in the original Hebrew, but were no longer in the Septuagint of Origen's day, and he has then inserted a Greek translation from an existing Greek translation in order to add that back into the Septuagint, to conform it to the Hebrew. And he always marks it so that we know what he added. We don't always know where he got it from. Sometimes it's his own translation, but usually he's used either Theodosian or Symmachus. And on a few occasions he used Aquila. So that's the meaning of the asterisk or asteriscus. You can add that into your final exam study notes. Let's move to the Latin Vulgate. This is Codex Amiatinus from the 8th century to approximately the 8th century AD, from 690 to 716 AD. It was found in Ireland, and it's a fascinating codex of the Latin Vulgate. Here are the Book of Psalms. Here's Psalm 22 to 25 in the Vulgate, which is includes Psalm 23, which is Psalm 22 in the Vulgate. And the interesting thing about this psalm is its heading, because we have Mizmor LeDavid, a psalm of David, is the Hebrew Masoretic text for the psalm inscription. But this codex gives Psalmist David vox ecclesiae post raptismum, literally a psalm of David, the voice of the church after the rapture. Fascinating. Now, before you go jumping on that real quickly and decide that, hey, there's proof of the pre-tribulation rapture then, and et cetera, first of all, it doesn't say pre or post or mid, number one. Number two, rapto here and raptismum in the Latin can have two possible meanings. It can mean not only rapture, as to seize and take away, it can mean to harass or to persecute. So what did the codex scribe intend? What was he thinking here? Is he talking about the voice of the church after its persecution? Or is he talking about the voice of the church after its rapture? You see? Two possibilities. The only way we'll ever be able to solve this problem, and by the way, I found this manuscript among photographs that I was reading in the back of Wertwein. And he gives this, talks about the codex and everything else, doesn't say anything about what's in it and what it says here. And as I was reading it and translating it, I came across this and I thought, wow, this is really amazing. This is something. Well, the only way we'll ever solve this is to get that codex, Amiatinus, to have access to all of the psalm headings. And then from all the psalm headings to then try to derive a methodology, the thinking of the scribe of this Vulgate copy as to the purpose and the way that they added to these headings. Obviously, they were being interpretive and inserting into it some of their interpretive thinking from their theology in that environment. Did they accept the rapture of the church, believe in the rapture of the church, and at what time? Well, we'd have to go back and find out if this is dealing with rapture or whether it's dealing with persecution. And we have to look at the headings on Psalm 22 and Psalm 24 and many other places as well. But eventually we could reach a conclusion that would be fairly confident and dogmatic, whether it's a reference to the rapture or a reference to persecution. There's another doctoral dissertation. Who wants to do it? You got to know some Latin, and you got to do some traveling. You got to go to Ireland and perhaps England and run this codex down and read the whole thing and check all of the background and history, find all the history you can about where this came from, who produced it, what the beliefs were, and other documents from that same religious group. And eventually, who knows, you may blow the lid off of the studies on pre-tribulation rapture by demonstrating that it was believed as early as the 7th century AD instead of starting with Darby. That's always a possibility. Okay? So you never know. You see, you never know what you're going to find. If you read the pictures in the books, pictures are worth 10,000 words. Sometimes they contain 10,000 words. All right? Read them. Pay attention to them. It goes on to give a traditional translation of the Vulgate here, of the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not lack. Okay? Now, let's summarize what we've done, because we want to bring all this to a close, have some summary comments before we go on to higher criticism. When we deal with the Old Testament textual critical evidence, we want to place it within a time continuum and a sense of priority of the evidence. So let's start with the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text. And you could put in here proto-masoretic text because basically the Masoretic text has testimony back through time that demonstrates that the text as we now have it is essentially the same text that was there 300 years before Christ for both the Septuagint and for the Qumran scrolls, for the Samaritan Pentateuch, and then also in the text of Aquila in the 2nd century AD, and then 3rd century AD in the text of the Hexapla, where Origen let us know what the Hebrew was of his day, and then the Vulgate of Jerome in the 5th century AD, and then finally the Masoretes themselves starting in the 6th, the 7th, and 8th centuries AD. We have a continual line of landmarks, milestones that we can follow back and see that the Masoretic text as we now have it is confirmed by not only the Masoretes between 500 and 700 AD and following and all their work, but it is the same text Jerome used in 400 AD. It's the same text that we find in Origen's Hexapla in 230 AD. It's the same text we find in Aquila in 130 AD. It's the same text we find in Qumran from everywhere from 70 AD back to 250, 300 BC. It's the same text we find in the Samaritan Pentateuch that goes from 100 BC in its finalized form all the way back to 400 BC when it was first initiated. It's the same text that is represented in the Qumran and Dead Sea Scrolls all the way back to 300 BC. All of these things show that the Masoretic text is there. So let's think of the Masoretic text then as legitimately representative of the original Hebrew text, whether you call it proto-masoretic or whether you call it Masoretic text. The first text, time-wise, following that, coming toward us in time, is the Samaritan Pentateuch, starting 400 BC and going to 100 BC, ultimately finalized in 100 BC. The oldest manuscript available only dates back to about 1300 AD that we have in hand, other than those that we find at Qumran. There's a great deal of debate about them as whether they're truly Samaritan Pentateuchs or whether they're translations from the Samaritan Pentateuch or whether they're imitations of the Samaritan Pentateuch. 400 to 100 BC. The Septuagint is next. The Septuagint is 250 to 150 BC. Some would date it as early as 300 BC. So the Septuagint also must be considered, and it is the next line of evidence. If you're in the Pentateuch, you continue from the Samaritan Pentateuch. If you're elsewhere, you begin with Septuagint after the Hebrew text. And the Qumran texts come right after that. They run from 300 BC to AD 50, AD 70 by some accounts. And then the Syriac Peshitta began in 125 AD, finalized in 400 AD. The Hexapla, 230 AD, because of the fact that it's 100 years after the beginning of the Syriac Hexapla. And then the Latin Vulgate, AD 390 to 404. Now you say, but where are the Aramaic targums? The Aramaic targums date back as early as 400 BC in their tradition and are basically finalized by 100 AD with some additional work done as late as 400 AD, depending on what targums you're looking at. The Aramaic targums are not considered here because of the fact that they're so paraphrastic in nature. They're more interesting to understand Jewish theology and Jewish hermeneutics of that period of time than they are to understand what Hebrew text they are based upon. Now, from time to time, there are discussions, there are expansions within the Jewish Targum that help us to understand perhaps what the Hebrew text said. But it's not always a great help. For example, on Genesis 49:10, the Jewish Targum identifies that individual clearly as the Messiah. But it doesn't help us in determining whether it's Shiloh or Shelo. It doesn't give us the distinction. It just tells us it is the Messiah. We know then that the rabbis, the early rabbis, saw that as a messianic text. Of course, that's the reason why it became a text that was controversial, and why you have a debate then even in the early church of what reading you adopt and accept. So this is the evidence that we have. This is what we look at when we're talking about textual criticism of the Old Testament. Darren?
What is the earliest manuscript for the Masoretic text?
The earliest manuscript of the Masoretic text, technical Masoretic text, not what I've got here, equivalent to proto-Masoretic. The first manuscript of the Masoretic text that we have, the oldest, dates about 840 AD. And it's from the Cairo Geniza. And it's in fragments. 840 AD. The Aleppo Codex, remember, dates about 930 AD. And Leningradensis, that's the basis of Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, is 1008 AD. Okay, other questions? Okay, now what we're going to move then to here is into the next. In fact, I have a couple more things here, though, I'm going to do before we get there. Excuse me. We're going to move into higher criticism, but before we move into it, I want to draw your attention to page 27 of the syllabus, where I've given you a definition of textual criticism. I want you to remember that definition. And I've noted on there some issues regarding manuscript errors. We talked about that. You had a couple of them on a quiz today. The canons of textual criticism was the last question on today's quiz. And then I've got several notes there from F.I. Anderson. I want you to read those notes very carefully, because what they're going to say to you is this scholar who's from Australia, who I admire greatly, who did the book, the commentary on the book of Job in the Tyndale Old Testament Commentary Series, who together with Forbes has put together a study edition of the grammar, syntax, and the syntactical arrangement of the entire Old Testament that's being published in Libronics format. One of the great scholars of the Hebrew text says here, gives his testimony that when he worked with David Noel Friedman on the Micah commentary in the Anchor Bible series, that they looked at that text and looked at all of the different people, the different scholars who kept saying, well, we've got to amend the text, we've got to change the text here or there. It's all confused. It doesn't sound right. It sounds ungrammatical. Someone asked during the break about the so-called ungrammatical portions in Ezekiel. Well, it's not really ungrammatical at all. It's perfectly in keeping with the type of Hebrew used at that time. It's not apocalyptic, because the same type of odd grammar you see in Ezekiel is found in the book of Ruth. Ruth isn't apocalyptic, and Ruth is older than Ezekiel. Gesenius talks about that grammar and demonstrates. You can have a masculine subject with a feminine verb. You can have a masculine plural subject with a feminine plural verb. You can have all kinds of anomalies and changes. And that happens a lot. It's one of those areas that if people were really going to update the Hebrew text, they would have updated those sections. That's why I argue there is no such thing as textual updating. It's a figment of the modern imagination, an attempt to try to resolve problems that our own ignorance has not allowed us to solve yet. And so we try to find a way to claim a rational reason for what we see. And that would have been changed. That would have been updated had there been textual updating. But they look at this, they say, notice they say in the last paragraph, David Noel Friedman and I came up with a crazy idea that this crazy text was exactly that. It is an effective rendition of the sobs and screams of a person who has lost all self-control in paroxysms of rage and grief. In other words, language allows for emotion. Language allows for all kinds of things we do with it. You look there in Genesis and you see when God says, behold, the man that we have made in our image is about to reach his hand out to the tree of life and take of the fruit and eat. And it's begun in such a way that you have this pen there, lest in the Hebrew it means. Lest he reach out and take. But it's never completed. It's an incomplete sentence. And translators try to complete it. We add in italics these completions. Well, let's do something about it. Let's kill him. Let's remove him. Let's cast him out. Let's banish him, whatever that you might add in there. But it's left incomplete. Why? Well, it's just like you and I. We get emotional. Maybe we get upset with one of our children and we're loss of words. If you do that one more time, and it's an incomplete sentence, we never finish it. But the intent is quite obvious by the tone of voice, by the look in the eyes, by the inflection of the words. We don't have to complete it. And that's basically the same thing we have there. So we don't move into that text and hypothesize that something's dropped out. We don't hypothesize that it's ungrammatical. We don't hypothesize that the text is incomplete or corrupted in some fashion. We accept it as a direct statement of exactly what God said in the emotion with which he said it. The same in Micah, the same in Ezekiel, the same in many places. And we have to allow the text to speak for itself. And ultimately we'll find that it's equally grammatical. It's equally valid Hebrew. And we shouldn't be messing around with it as though we knew biblical Hebrew better than the original writers. I don't know about you, but I can't make that claim at all. Can't even come close. So to me, it is just pooling our ignorance in an attempt to change the text because we have the hubris, the arrogance to think that we have greater knowledge and skill and ability in the language and the text and in life, etc., and history and everything else than the writers of the text. That's not the way to treat the text. Bottom line, the Bible as we have it is trustworthy. The Bible as we have it, even in our English translation, is the Word of God, insofar as it is accurately transmitted and translated. We recognize a few problems in the text of the Old Testament. We noted the missing words in 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 1. But there are no major omissions that can be detected. There are no major variants that affect any major doctrine. The vast majority of textual variants in the Hebrew Old Testament are minor. They're what we call recurrent variants. They're not material variants. If we were to take all the material variants together and pool them and say how much space they take up and how much the text, it'd be less than 1% of the total text that we'd be even questioning. Less than 1%. In some estimations, 1/10 of 1%. So I'm allowing a little bit of exaggeration there. And yet none of those affect any major doctrine or teaching of the text. We have a dependable Bible. And the Masoretic text is the best text we have, and it is demonstrated to be very close to, if not identical, to the text that we can trace all the way back to 300 years before Christ. Any final questions before we move to higher criticism, away from lower criticism? Question, Felix.
Somebody had mentioned that you don't really have to learn Hebrew so much because you have the Septuagint. So once you learn Greek, then you can study the Old Testament through the Septuagint.
Okay, the question is it true what some people say that we really don't need to know Hebrew? We just need to know Greek. We can study the Septuagint and get to the Old Testament there. I would object to that because the Septuagint is not the Word of God directly. It's not as close to what the original was given by God. It wasn't given by Him in Greek in the Old Testament. I would say that we have to recognize that the Greek Septuagint is translated on the whole by an aberrant, heretical Jewish sect living in Alexandria, Egypt, and that we shouldn't rely upon a text like that, a translation like that, for our doctrine and for our practice, that we have an obligation to seek the truth. We have an obligation to get back to what God originally gave as close as possible, and therefore the best way to do that is to go back to the Hebrew text. If we're going to take that argument, if that argument were to be held as true, then why study even Greek? Why not just stay in English? After all, it's translation also. So why don't we just stick with translation? The only problem is the standard definition, first of all, of the inspired text is this text as God gave it, number one. Number two, the final authority for all of faith and practice resides in the original texts. So that takes us beyond the Greek, takes beyond the Greek Septuagint. Okay? Good question. Rob?
When you take the Hebrew text and put it into the Greek, do you lose like alliteration and assonance and word order and that sort of thing where you see in the Hebrew when you study the Hebrew language? Do you lose a lot of that when it's...
Okay, the question is, do we lose a lot of the Hebrew text in translation into the Greek Septuagint? There is some loss. It depends on the skill of the individual translator and in the individual book. I already mentioned the skill of the translator and the accuracy of translating the perfect and imperfect of the Hebrew stative verb in Genesis. That's not always true in the rest of the Septuagint. You don't have that type of accuracy. So it depends on what book you're looking at. And in some places, yes, it has a great effect. A key example that you can see just by comparing your English Bibles, for example, is to look at Acts chapter 8, verses 33, I think it is, to 34, where you have the Ethiopian eunuch is reading from Isaiah chapter 53. He's reading chapter 53, I think it's verses 7 and 8. Verse 7 looks fine. But look at verse 8. It is very different than what we have in the Old Testament in Isaiah 53, verse 8. Very, very different. It's not the same at all. And why? It's because, as Gleason Archer and Cherry Chigno bring out in their book on the Old Testament, the New Testament use of the Old Testament, that it is the most aberrant translation in the Septuagint of any known text. And yet, God used Philip to take that text and to preach to the Ethiopian Jesus from that text. So it didn't prevent the text from getting the ultimate message across. It didn't hide the fact that the text spoke of a person, not a nation. And that the Ethiopian eunuch asked, about whom is this text speaking? About whom is the writer speaking? About himself or some other individual? And Philip was able to start there and tell him that it was about the Messiah and that the Messiah was Jesus. But you look at that, and you'll see that the text there is very, very different in the Septuagint as compared to the Hebrew. There they have totally mutilated the text. And yet that mutilated text, perhaps that's one of the reasons why the Ethiopian eunuch had difficulty understanding it too, and needed someone to help him understand. Okay, anyone else? Any questions? Yes, Jeremy.
How does the Old Testament quote itself?
Okay, good question. How does the Old Testament quote itself? Oftentimes it'll just give it without an introductory formula. Or it will say something like the Lord says, or the Lord said, or has said, or the declaration of the Lord. So that, for example, Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 and 7 is cited by at least 5 or 6 different Old Testament authors. And in each case, you can see that is a reference back to that section of Scripture. And it's always accurate, always in context, and there's no discernible difference in text. And this is an important point. I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the current hot-button topics is intertextuality. The study of how the Bible uses itself, how the Old Testament uses itself, how other Old Testament writers, like the prophets, used the law of Moses. How did they quote it? How did they cite it? You see, there are some who say the only text we can ever recover is the one that was canonized 400 BC, and we shouldn't go any further back, and that's the final inspired text, and there's no such thing as autographa. We shouldn't worry about autographa. We don't have to worry about getting back to the originals. Well, the quotations from the Pentateuch that are found elsewhere in the Old Testament demonstrate that there was an accepted canonical text before the time of those prophets' writing, and that there was a known text, a standardized text, and we can check to see how they used it, how they referred to it, and we can compare to see if it's the same as what we currently have in those passages in the Pentateuch. It's another way of pushing the bar back further and trying to understand better what the text was as far back as we can go. And if we were to find differences in the way the Old Testament uses a passage, different types of interpretation, or even different wordings, we need to look to find out why. Was that done by the writer themselves to fit the context in which they placed it, as often in the New Testament? Or was this a different reading? There are some who argue that there were different readings, that every king of Israel was required. And here's another argument for the stability, the writtenness, the canonization of the Pentateuch especially. Remember, Moses was told to write it down, place it in the Ark of the Covenant. And then kings, according to Deuteronomy 17, were required to make copies of the law, exact copies of the law. And they were to read it for themselves, and they were to obey it. And so some point out that meant there were other copies down through the ages. And that's why the documentarians go back to Josiah for the Deuteronomic document, is they believe all we have is the law as was found in the days of Josiah and copied by Josiah. So those are all studies you want to go back and take a look at. If you want to get involved in intertextual studies, it's a valid, very beautiful area. Everyone's interested in the New Testament's use of the Old Testament. Very few have really gotten into the Old Testament's use of the Old Testament. And the interesting thing is, the Old Testament's use of the Old Testament might have a lot to say about how the New Testament uses the Old Testament. Okay? Good question, Jeremy. Thank you. Gave me the opportunity to wax eloquent again there. All right? Okay, let's get a brief start 5 minutes here on higher criticism. We're on page 28 and following of your syllabus. There's a good deal of material here that I wish for you to read over. Pages 28 to 30, you should go over with a fine-tooth comb. You should read it carefully. Try to understand what is there. I provide you with a number of quotations, a good introduction to higher criticism. Higher criticism, when we look at it here, we're talking about liberal theological approaches to the Old Testament. Lower criticism is textual criticism. It deals with the text itself, the bottom layer, the foundation of all theological consideration. Higher criticism is above and beyond the text. It's the interpretation of the text. It's theories about the text. And so, as we talk here about higher criticism, we're using it in a more specified, more specific way now, referring specifically to liberal theological approaches to the Old Testament. By definition, this is from Sullin and Sullin, an excellent handbook on biblical criticism. It refers in the broadest sense to the use of rational judgment in understanding the Bible. Basically, it's taking our thinking, human rational, and attempting to interpret the Bible, attempting to understand what the Bible is. More narrowly, it refers to an approach to the study of Scripture that is centrally concerned with searching for and applying neutral, notice that term neutral, which has to be defined carefully as scientific and non-sectarian canons of judgment in its investigation of the biblical text. Now that is the catch-all, and that is where the rub is. That's where the difficulty lies. Who determines this? Who determines what is scientific, non-sectarian? Who among us is non-sectarian? Who among us can empty ourselves of all of our beliefs that make us somewhat subjective in our approach to the text and become totally objective? Are we willing to put it into the hands of secular scholars who will then apply the laws and rules of scientific investigation to the text? But keep in mind, those scholars also have a philosophy that taints their approach to the text. For example, being evolutionists, the majority of them then are going to allow for an evolutionary view of the development of religion, from the most primitive up to then the more sophisticated. And they're going to impose that view upon the text they interpret. They also are mainly non-supernaturalists. They do not accept miracles. Therefore, all miracles or supernatural events in the Scripture will be looked at with prejudice and with suspect. There'll be suspicion there. The hermeneutics of doubt and skepticism, the Trollschian standard of skepticism, will be applied. They will also approach the text saying the text does not stand as a priori evidence. It cannot be accepted as truth in and of and by itself. It must be substantiated by external evidence. And if it is not substantiated by external evidence, then therefore it will not be accepted as truth, as scientific evidence. It will be thrown out of the court of law as being nothing but myth. This is the issue, gentlemen. And this is what is gradually working its way into evangelical circles, which at one time stood as a separate block in a separate way, totally against this kind of approach to Scripture. Now, as we go through and talk about these things, I'll be pointing out the negatives and the positives. Because even historical criticism, which has a lot of negatives, has some positive elements that we can learn from. We'll talk about those as we go through. But we must go into this understanding exactly what's being talked about. This is a definition given by W.G.T. Shedd. That which now goes under the name of higher criticism was formerly known as conjectural criticism in the 16th and 17th centuries. Now think about that a minute. That's very revealing. In other words, a lot of it is guessing. We'll see in form criticism that form criticism seeks to restore or to get back to the oral tradition. Now, the words I've just spoken are being recorded on camera and on CD, and so my words can be taken later and reviewed, and we have an objective analysis of my words. But what about oral tradition in the time of the patriarchs? They didn't have recording techniques. And if you're talking about oral tradition, you're not talking about written tradition. Normally, that which is spoken disappears just like that. It's gone. It's not reproducible. It's only reproducible in the memories of those who heard it. And those memories may have heard different things. When I teach in the class here, I know by some of your questions, you hear different things. Because one hears something over here, and one hears something over here. One asks about this, one asks about this. And then again, someone over here asks the same question that someone previously already asked. So sometimes we don't even hear each other. So that's very subjective, is it not, to try to restore oral tradition? And that's what form criticism does. It's in the area of conjecture. It's hypothetical. It's in the area of things we cannot do and cannot know. Jeremy?
So would it be safe to say then that higher criticism is an attempt to get behind the text?
That's a good question. Is higher criticism then an attempt to get behind the text? Yes. One area of higher criticism is to get behind the text to find out where the text came from, why it arose, why it was written, and what uses it was put to at the beginning.
Then is there any profit as a believer in doing that? Because God just says, here's my word, and I don't see anything in Scripture that directs me to try to get behind, even knowing that Luke did research, I don't even see like a point in getting there, other than just to answer unbelievers.
All right, it's a good question. I'm going to repeat the question, but I'm not going to answer it today because our time's up. But we're going to be answering that throughout this whole process because that is part of the whole rub. And we're going to ask it a number of times through the process, including again at the end when I will then give a fuller answer to it as we wrap it all up. But the question is here, of what use is it for me to study then what's behind the text, if it's really just the text that's important and significant that God has given? Can't I just accept the text and not bother about these? And I will give you an answer in the days ahead.